So I'll be the host and you can be the responder, and then we'll flip. How's that?
Oh, geez. Put me on the spot. All right, let's go.
Okay.
It's a big question to start.
Okay, so and my apologies, it's not Sheila, it's Jill that we're waiting for. Okay, but the big question, yes, absolutely. The reason why we're all here is to ask the question, what are the pros and cons to expansion? So how about you start, and then I can fill in some pieces after.
Well, I would start, and I'm sure everybody who's here today would echo, it's an exciting moment in Canada's history to have the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Program even in our orbit. I have been working in this field for over 20 years and have started as a parent advocate when my eldest son was in childcare and we were on subsidy, and sort of just knew how important it was to me and to my little family, and and always sort of was advocating for something like this. Never imagined in my lifetime I'd see it. So participating in the expansion of opportunities for other parents and children to be able to experience what my family has experienced, and what I've committed my working life to, is a huge pro. We're in this moment that is exciting and that we need to celebrate. However, there's a lot of complexity, needless to say. So, specifically around expansion, I think, obviously we've all, if you've worked in this field for any length of time, that one of the big pressures we've all faced is accessibility, and just there being enough spaces for families to be able to access. And then, of course, there's the affordability question. I hope we'll get to talk about quality at some point, but so far, not just yet. And that's part of what Kim and I were talking about at the very beginning before we realized everybody was here. So, it's the opportunity to really seize on a moment and realize, I think, the imaginations many of us have had and the dreams many of us have had for so many years. The cons are that there's still a lot of uncertainty. We're in the midst of a huge transformative system change. It's all happening under really, really tight timelines. And it's ambitious in its objectives. So, we have to contend with a lot of uncertainty. And I think on the expansion question, when you start talking about uncertainty, it gets tricky, because you're talking about huge investments of money. You're talking about people's livelihoods, both from a parent perspective, they need childcare to be able to work, but also for our staff in terms of what we're able to commit to, what it means for them in their daily work. So, right off the top, those would be the biggies. The pros is just to advance this amazing historic initiative that Canada has embarked upon. The cons are that we're in the messiness of how the heck to do it. And we can get into more granular stuff, but I'll let you maybe comment on your first thoughts on pros and cons, Kim.
Oh, and we have Jill joining us. Yay, Jill. We can't quite hear you yet because you're just connecting to audio, but there we are. Okay, can you hear us now, Jill?
I can. Sorry, I have no idea. We've had one of those tech days here at the office. Nobody can get into SharePoint. It's just one of those days. So I never had.
Welcome. Take a breath. It's a friendly group. We've already learned that that technology is our friend, but sometimes unfriendly. And so no worries, Jill. No worries at all. We've introduced ourselves, but how about you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Jill Wickens, and I am the Compass Early Learning and Care's Operations Link, supporting licensing and program expansion within our 4 different communities.
Which are?
Yeah.
Where are you located, Jill?
I'm personally, right now, I'm sitting in Peterborough.
There we go.
That's where our office central is, and
you operate all in that Eastern Ontario region, yes?
Yeah, we are in Northumberland, so Kawartha Lakes, Haliburton, Durham region, Eastern Durham region, and a city and county of Peterborough.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful. So we were just starting to answer the question, the pros and cons to expansion. So why should we even be considering this idea? And Michele made some really good positive reasons why, obviously, to be able to respond to children and families and our ever-growing waiting list, and of course our belief and value in the not-for-profit sector. but also well, because it's the right thing to do. And there are economies of scale. We're going to get into some of that as well. There's economies of scale and advantages, of course, being a multi-site operator. But then there's some cons, and definitely, we would be naive if we didn't identify that there's some people are hesitant. We're trying to build a system. As Michele said, we're in this really transformational phase. The Canada-wide early learning childcare agreement is a generational, once in a generation, impactful opportunity, but we're building on unstable ground. It feels like we still have lots of unanswered questions, and we're kind of tired, right? We've been between what was already a challenge pre-COVID, and then during COVID, and then all this other change. And we always talk about our sector being really dynamic and flexible and able to evolve, but it has felt like quite a bit in the last couple of years. And so people are tired, and we have lots of questions around compensation, appropriate compensation for staff, lots of questions about leadership supports, stability, and our boards have those same questions. So we know that we have some cons, but let's jump right into the next question, and then because I think it's a really important one, which is what would be some of the very important preliminary? So let's just say you are still committed. We haven't, you're not scared off. You know that you need to, you really want to expand. That you can see that there's opportunities also for your families, but also but other opportunities as well for your center. And now you're ready to have those conversations with your board. And so, what would be that preliminary information if you go to your board with a smile and full of enthusiasm? What does your board need to know? How about Jill? Do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. We often think about it a little bit differently. We don't go in with the idea that expanding is the only thing that we're bringing to the table. It's an opportunity to share our skills and knowledge, lessons learned, and that we're meeting a need within our community. And we work with our community partners to understand better what those needs are. And then the why behind why this place, why now, and then to together decide, is it best for us at this time.
Excellent. And how about you, Michele? Do you have some preliminary data that you'd like to share, or preliminary information?
Interestingly, for my organization, we just literally in March of 2020, I presented a strategic plan to my board of directors that included expansion. So we had done a lot of pre-thinking before the pandemic hit about expansion, having no idea that A, we would be in the midst of a global pandemic, or B, that we would have this historic new national childcare program rolling out. So I can tell you that the conversation has evolved a little bit. Our initial conversations, and in the essence of them, in both circumstances, sort of pre-COVID, when we didn't even imagine CWELC would ever come to be or even exist, and then more recently, it really was about, sort of, to Jill's point, meeting community needs, assessing what's happening across the communities that we serve, and how might we best, as an organization that's exclusively focused on children and their families, help to address some of those gaps and those needs. So, expansion was on the table, and it can take many forms. New centers, amalgamating with an existing center, morphing some of our centers to be potentially something larger, et cetera, et cetera. So there was, I think the first point of conversation was really making the case for the organization, for the board, around why it is that they should even consider it. And it has to be rooted in our purpose, which is to serve families and children. Secondarily, there's a business conversation to have, so at that time we were really thinking about sort of what was happening when we were first starting, and I think it's the same now, is like, what's happening in the environment, what's the context for us to potentially consider evolving, growing, morphing, shifting to meet those community needs. And what's obvious right now is that there's this ambitious plan to see childcare access significantly increased across Canada. So, you know, part of the conversation is we want to seize the opportunity. It aligns with our mission and vision and values, but also secondarily, or whatever that is, I'm on number 3, is that it's an opportunity that if we don't take advantage of it, we could get left behind. And, you know, that doesn't mean that that's the end of Mothercraft, for example, but it does mean that if we have other ambitions on things we want to do, we may not be in the position that we want to be in to be able to fulfill or pursue those. So, you know, so there's a few things and that were sort of off the top. And then, of course, you know, the questions that come from the board are really, you know, on point and the appropriate ones. What are the risks? How do we mitigate those risks? What are some of the unanticipated consequences of expansion, and how best can we contemplate those, plan for those, and be ready to be able to address them if and when they actually emerge, including things we can't even contemplate. So I think it's a really practical conversation that's rooted in mission, that's rooted in purpose, that's rooted in practical business capabilities, opportunities, and then really sort of mapping out with your eyes open what the path forward is. What are all the little bits that have to be considered? But, you know, is in that, you know, I did a lot of work to do presentations to my board about what CWELC is, presenting as much information as we can get, answering as many questions as they could have, but continually bringing it back to what is it that we want to see happen in our organization in terms of the fulfillment of our mission and vision, and what do we need to do to sustain the business? Those two critical bits.
Excellent, excellent. And our journey actually at Angus Fleck Children's Services in Ottawa was actually quite similar. I'm going to give a bit of context, but in the meantime, we have questions that we were going to answer, but we also want to make sure that anybody who has questions for us, so please put your questions in the chat, in the Q&A section, and we'll make sure that we answer them. So we started our thinking way back in 2010, actually, when full-day kindergarten was being implemented, and there seemed to be quite a bit of unsettledness and concern in Ottawa. And our board decided, similar to what Jill said, to take a position that we didn't want to see any loss of not-for-profit capacity in our sector. So what could we do as already a slightly larger agency to support our community, from providing advice, resources, access to some of our policies, up to and including amalgamation. And so that was kind of our premise for a long, long time. Then when we had our next strategic plan back in 2015, our board said, okay, well, we really want to be very purposeful in meeting the community demands. And so it did take a lot of conversations, right? That, you know, strategic plans don't just kind of materialize. They do need to be grounded in some facts and a vision. And so we had done all that background work and then set our strategic plan for 2015. Was supposed to continue into 2020, and we realized actually that we weren't quite done, and it extended a little bit longer. And then now we have our new strategic plan. And we try to be really public with that, and it's actually on our website. If anybody wants to see it, or if you want to see our earlier ones, we're happy to share, even happy to share sort of some of the preliminary materials that we needed to gather in order to have those conversations with our board. And so we have grown actually quite a bit since 2010, many amalgamations, a couple of new centers, and they all feel right, and we're excited about each and every one of them. But they all did take an opportunity. For every single one, we did have to have some really detailed conversations about the risk analysis and was this the right thing to do. And it didn't mean that we always, not everyone who approached us were we able to welcome. There were some that unfortunately, just based on, for different reasons, they just were not going to work. So you do have to have a lot of information, I would say, to make sure that your board is well prepared, because you're asking for a pretty big leap of faith often. And there's often, you know, gaps, right? Gaps of timing between funding or energy that needs to be spent. And so your board has to be alongside and see that as a community responsibility. I would say, though, us as an organization, we have benefited so much by having other existing organizations join us, or by building some new buildings, or expanding the economies of scale that we've been able to create. But also the messaging that we've been able to create as well has been really strong and quite purposeful, and has, I think, strengthened our organization overall as a whole. Let me just check what the couple of questions.
I just want to jump in for whatever this is worth. You know, one of the things that we did at Mothercraft in preparation for our strategic plan, sort of pre-COVID, pre-CWELC, was sort of really have a detailed discussion about what is it that the board would want to know to feel comfortable around making a decision, whether it's related to expansion or anything else, but it was primarily focused on expansion. And we came up with what we call an opportunities decision-making tool. And it has some components that I just thought it might be helpful for folks to consider as you're thinking about your conversations with your own board. So first and foremost, there's 4 or 5 sections to it. First and foremost is the philosophical alignment. So whatever it is that we're considering, whether that's a new center or something else, but in this context, a new center, does the opportunity for expansion align with Mothercraft's vision, mission, vision, and value? Does it fall within our charitable objects? And is it consistent with our theoretical framework and service delivery models? Second was to look at demonstrated demand and operational feasibility. I'm not going to go into all the details of each of these, but you know, you can sort of figure out what that means. Third was financial viability and sustainability. And then fourth was enterprise risk management. So sort of identifying and mitigating risks to the corporation. And within that one, in this, I just think this might help in your thinking if you haven't thought of all of these elements as well. There are 5 elements related to the risk management. First being strategic risk. Does the expansion opportunity align with our strategic objectives? Or does it represent any risk to the achievement of the strategic plan? Reputational risk. Would it create any sort of brand risk or reputation problems for us as a service provider or registered charity? Legal or regulatory risks, so going in thinking about what the legislative framework is, what the legal, contractual, or other regulatory risks might be inherent in a particular pathway. Funding and financial risks, so looking really at what all of the both startup and the ongoing financial commitments would be, and would it have any potential, create any potential risk for operations or future funding opportunities. And then lastly, operational risk. Do we have the capacity internally with from an administrative perspective, from a program delivery perspective, to consider before we move forward with the opportunity. So it's been really helpful for our board to have sort of a framework to think about what are the components. And we did all that work thinking about expansion, which was really great. So that now we're into CWELC, we can just pull that off the shelf and say, boop, 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 boop. Have we thought about all of these different components? Have we thought about all of the elements that might be of some concern to the board, and how would we respond to them? I don't always have the answers to all of the questions, but at least folks know that I've been thinking about them, and I can say we don't know in that area, or we do know, and here's what we would propose would be the mitigating strategy.
That's excellent. And I think it highlights, right, that you don't just wake up one morning and decide, okay, I think I'm going to expand. This does need to be entrenched conversations. Quite often they take quite a long time. We call them at our organization aspirational projects. So I started to have these conversations really early and think about what could be. I mean, there might be some that come up really quickly, but generally you want to be having these conversations, even if they're not immediately on the horizon. You want to have your board ready and yourself ready, and be putting it out kind of publicly as well, so that your CMSM or DSAP understands that this is actually an energy that you're willing to commit to. Mm-hmm. Jill, and then just before I get you to ask or answer any of the questions, I made another mistake. Oh my goodness, Sarah, we need more Zoom training. So I clicked on one of the questions, and then I clicked on answer live, and then it disappears. So my apologies. The question though was about amalgamations, and did organizations approach us or did we approach them? So in our situation, actually all the small organizations approached us every single time, and often they approached more than one entity in Ottawa and wanted to their board did their due diligence, their very appropriate due diligence, and wanted to determine where was going to be the best fit for their ongoing viability of the organization and their current staff. Hopefully that answers that. Do you have anything else you want to add, Jill, before we go to more questions?
No, I just wanted to say that, yes, we too have a strategic plan that we created in 2015 that did also identify building capacity as part of our values, visions, and mission. And so you're right, everything aligns nicely with that, with the questions built right into our strategic plan too, to help guide us through some of that decision making. I do love the risk idea, and identifying those 5 levels of risk is a great idea. Hadn't considered it, so I'm going to take that forward.
There you go. See?
Yeah.
Email you the tool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Love it.
We're always learning, right? Always learning.
Yeah, always.
There was a question actually in the chat where somebody was identified that they have a location actually that has been closed for 10 years in their area, and they're looking to reopen it, and kind of what steps should they do first. So usually when you're at that point, your board has a commitment and you're interested in reopening a location, usually, or opening a location, usually zoning is one of the very first pieces, right? You need to make sure that the zoning is applicable. If it's been 10 years, you would still need to get a new zoning letter. And you would also actually need to make sure that the space still met the licensing requirements. So you would need what they call a building letter, like something from an architect that says, okay, well, this setting, so it has enough windows, and toilets, and doors, and the square footage, because the ministry doesn't do this. But of course, we're also in this brave new world with CWELC, and then there's an additional layer of opportunity and application. So each CMSM, as you already all noticed, under CCLS, you need to put in your approach, your application. Before you put it into CCLS, you need to get approval from your CMSM, your DSAP. And so that's another layer. And there's probably going to be a bit of a timing lag if you are interested in CWELC funding. If you're not interested in CWELC funding, then that's quite different. But if you're interested in CWELC funding, because we're right now about to embark on expansion, the guidelines have not been released, and don't know that there's any CMSMs right now that are actually approving a new application. So that might be something to consider.
We have also run into different laws around what is allowed in an area when you talk about zoning, but the building people are in the building code has changed. And so it often is interpreted differently by different people. So you would have to start right from ground zero when you're starting with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's a good point on how I was saying that we've been talking about our studio plans back from 2015. My recent one is actually posted from 2021. Maybe even 2022, I can't remember now, it's terrible. And so the idea, the concepts haven't changed. So your plan needs to be broad enough to allow you to embark on what you want to do. They don't get it, the plan doesn't have the very, very specifics, but then you do get into the work plan pieces. So I think referring back to each of our organizations on our website, you'll find some details, but you can also contact any of us afterwards, and then we'll be happy to share what we can. But you definitely do need to think about expansion. If you're at all interested in the CWELC opportunities, which, as we know, those guidelines being released and those space allocations are all the way up to 2026. You need to be having those conversations right now with your board. You need to be getting ready.
I was going to just jump in to say, you don't need to have a strategic plan. Obviously, we're larger organizations. We have those. I think all multi-service. So you got to be thinking about a lot of different service streams. For a smaller organization, it may not be feasible to have a strategic plan, but we do absolutely have to, as nonprofits, we have to engage our boards because they are ultimately accountable and have the fiduciary responsibility for the corporation. And so they have to actually endorse and give you the direction as staff to proceed with the plan. And so I think it's, sort of the main thing is to, in my experience anyways, boards of directors, they got lives and they got families and jobs, and this is something that they're committed to do, to volunteer to sit on a board of directors, but it isn't their day-to-day. And so trying to make sure that they get the most salient components and points of what it means to have CWELC in place first and foremost, and what that translates to in terms of both opportunity and, you know, not necessarily risk, frankly, or at least careful considerations that should be contemplated before you move forward, I think is a really critical step. Don't feel the pressure of the timeline. We're all feeling the pressure of the timeline, but, you know, it's really important to have those conversations so everybody can feel comfortable. I think, especially when things start to move at a quicker pace, that then you're not going back while you're in the midst of it to say, is this really where we wanted to go or what we wanted to do? So get some really, you know, have some really frank conversations about what your capacity is, what your ambitions are, what it is that is driving, even contemplating an expansion. What do you anticipate, given your community context, given your organizational context, what do you anticipate as being both low-hanging fruit opportunities, but also potentially stop you in your tracks circumstances? So it's really about sort of where, you know, having those conversations about why to proceed, when to proceed, and what might, you know, give you pause to say, wait a second, maybe that's not the right direction or opportunity to pursue, is a really important piece to have with your board, because with the endorsement of your board, then you can run with things. If they've still got questions while you're trying to, you know, sort of make something happen, I think you sort of set yourself up for some added complication. Let's put it that way. So, you know, I think it's important to start those conversations now if you haven't already. But this is, to Kim's point, you know, there's still a few years, which is going to go by in a heartbeat. But better to make sure you're feeling grounded. And I've got the support of my board. We're all on the same page. They understand what the opportunities and risks are. They're going to have my back. We've got the capacity and everything put in place to be able to move ahead and deal with whatever comes, because there will be stuff that comes that we haven't anticipated or hasn't been figured out yet. There's lots of it still being figured out as we speak. But, you know, being able to feel the ability to take advantage, but also not sort of too many risks, I think is really time well spent.
You know, I would add to that actually, excellent response, Michele. And I would add to that, I think having the principle that as a not-for-profit, you are interested in expanding is really key, and sharing that very purposely with MSM once your board is on like, don't expect that all the risks will be mitigated or that you'll have an understanding of them all. I mean, again, the world is changing, but if we just sit back and we don't identify to our CMSMs that we have interest, then they of course have nothing out. They have no other way except to assume that there isn't an interest in the not-for-profit sector to expand. So what they need to hear from us is, why wouldn't we, right? So yes, we would be interested, but we can't because you're not giving us enough money, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. Whatever is whatever is going to be your board's concern, the barrier for you to be able to expand, that needs to be clear to the CMSM. Versus us just being silent and in our own boardrooms saying, oh, we can't take this on because it's too risky. But then, of course, it's just there's no interest. And so definitely, as the person put in the chat, you know, these are uncertain times and boards are concerned about risks. Agencies do have deficits and boards are doing what they're supposed to do. They are supposed to be concerned about those risks. I have a fun story from many years ago, very early on in my career. I was joining a program that was about to open up and all the staff had been hired. I was one of the new staff. I was standing outside and this really bold, brave ED of the organization was speaking to the city services person who was telling her, sorry, you can't meet the per diems that you want. And she said, okay, fine, we're not opening. And she turned around and walked away. And I stood there, I was like just 20 years old going, oh my gosh, she just hired me. Well, he chased her down and somehow they found the money. So, you know, we sometimes try to do so much with so little, but again, if your board just says, look, we can't unless you help us this way, let your CMSM know. Be really specific about that. It might not always work, but at least you've identified that you did have an interest as a not-for-profit to expand and there were barriers versus that there wasn't an interest. Right? I think that's really key. Sorry, Michele, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to see if Jill wanted to say anything to that. before I start rambling on again.
Yeah, no, I think you covered all the bases. The risk is our biggest conversations at our board levels, and how do we mitigate that through what information do they need to be able to make informed decisions and to best support us as we begin our journey into expansion. So yeah, I can't really add anything into your brilliant conversations.
I was just going to share sort of what's been happening at Mothercraft these last few months, because we've been obviously, we had a vision pre-COVID to expand, then everything went on the back burner. Now we're into Seawell. It's an entirely different approach to expansion in a Seawell context than in a Mothercraft driven context. And the deficit question, I think, is a really important one. We're all, depending on where you are in the province, there's, different pressures that are related to operating, but I think many of us are feeling the crunch of the uncertainty in this particular moment, of not having all of the information about what the funding model is going to look like. We know what we've come through, and thankfully the federal government was there for us through COVID. Then that stopped. And I don't know about the rest of you, but we had a lot of vacancies, and that was affecting our bottom line. We finished last year with a very significant deficit because of the post-pandemic recovery period and the pre-full Seawell implementation period. And so we're still in that. And so one of the conversations with my board late last year and into early this year was, wait a second, we lost a lot of money in 2022. We are asking us to take a chance on expansion. We know that when you open a new center, it isn't immediately net neutral. There's costs associated with the startup and that easing into full enrollment. So, what should we do? And the conversation was, how far do we go? How much of our own money do we put on the line? And when do we say that's enough? And so for us, it was end of 2023, where we will have had 2 years with significant deficit. Fortunately, we're an organization with some reserves. But having that difficult conversation and saying, how far can we go? Maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 2 months, maybe you have no appetite for a deficit. That's okay. Have that conversation. But then the next step, I think, is the critical bit, which is, to Kim's point, you go back to the people that are in charge of the system, whether that's your CMSM, DSAB, or even through the ministry. And I've had conversations with both saying, here's what my board is saying, and this is significant. We lost money. We're prepared to eat it for a little bit, but then there's no appetite to subsidize your objectives for the implementation of Seawell. And so, you need to know that that many of us will have to make what decisions are necessary in the interests of our organizations and those board of fiduciary responsibilities. And that may mean that we can't help you achieve your goal, which is to see 86,000 new spaces in Ontario, or X number of thousand new spaces in any CMSM DSAB jurisdiction, and be serious about it. And that's what I've been doing for the last several months, is to say, I want to participate, but unless we get some of these funding pressures and questions and uncertainties sorted out, we are not going to be able to do that. And that's going to affect what you're here to accomplish. And that's not, and they're driven by politics. So they will hear that, and they will hopefully act accordingly to resolve some of those pressures. They never resolve them fast enough, as far as I'm concerned, but we are hearing a lot. Kim and I sit at a lot of the same tables where folks are saying, that's really important that you've pointed that out. We didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. So there's a really important advocacy component, whether that's at the local level or it's at the bigger system level. And I think it's just got to be rooted in, what are your realities, and be open and honest and frank about them. We want to help you achieve the goal, but here's where our pressures lie. And these are the things that my board has to consider, and from both a legal perspective and a values perspective.
Excellent. There's another really good question in the chat about how can we justify expanding when there's an EC shortage? And yeah, that's actually the things that are keeping us up at night, right? Again, that push me, pull me. How are we stabilizing now? And then we're also wanting to expand. But as Michele said, the province and the federal government needs us just as much, if not more, than we need them, right?
right.
They need this system to work. They need families to have access to care. We're not going to fix the workforce crisis by not expanding. That's not going to fix anything. What we need to be doing is also at the same time having the very, very important compensation conversations. My opinion is we need to also stop just throwing out numbers and saying, oh, well, ECs should be paid this or that, or they should be paid the same as school boards. Let's actually do a really robust job evaluation of the role and determine what the salary needs to be, and then develop a provincial-wide wage scale. There might be regional differences based on cost of living, all those other pieces, but let's make sure we do that. And that has to be happening at the same time. But again, we have a workforce crisis even without expanding. So absolutely, we can't just sit idle on either one. The problem is if we don't, as not-for-profits, expand, we're putting ourselves at risk that there are for-profits that will. And that will be an even bigger fiasco, I think, and disaster for our sector. It's tough. I get it. And so when, as Michele said, you go back to your CMSM, you go back to the province and say, we want to be able to expand, but we can't. One of the reasons that we wouldn't be able to because of the workforce. We cannot recruit and retain early childhood educators unless you are allowing us to appropriately compensate them. The messaging that we've been giving, right, is that for decades, not-for-profits have subsidized the cost of childcare. We've made childcare affordable for families at the expense of our own salaries. And that, so now we're seeing the consequence, right? So we need to continue to articulate that. And we have a whole bunch of other things we could say about compensation and workforce, but that's not quite what the focus was today. But we did also want to talk about co-locating. I think, that's one area that, again, in our agency, we've been focused on, and I'm curious to hear what Jill and Michele have been doing. In the past, we kind of thought that our logical partner was perhaps a school board, or that we need to be standalone. And in the last couple of years, we've shifted our approach a little bit, and we decided that we really want to see childcare co-located in communities, where we, so we're reaching out to what might be considered non-traditional partners. We don't feel a great need to actually own buildings, even though we happen to own some. But what was more important to us is that children are seen and heard, that they're really in neighborhoods where they're welcomed, and perhaps even maybe changing the landscape of a neighborhood a little bit. We're having conversations with long-term care, with seniors housing, with other affordable housing partners, others who maybe actually have the scope and mandates to build that we don't have, and saying we want to be located alongside you, and what could that look like? And we've been welcomed, actually. We're having some really great conversations and finding that there's some good partnerships now being developed. So I would encourage people to not think that maybe they have to do this on their own. And in particular, I think we're finding that often a reason why those doors are open is because for long-term care or senior support services, they're struggling to recruit employees. And so having childcare co-located is a big opportunity for them actually to address their own workforce crisis. But Jill, did you want to add something to that?
I would say absolutely. We have just recently, during COVID, opened up a location in a Ontario housing, in Peterborough Housing Corporation, and we're living in with the same residents, and it's been just absolutely fabulous, learning and living and playing together, and it really has opened up many doors and better understandings of earlier learning and care, and that we're looking also at long-term care homes right now, and we're looking at hospitals because healthcare needs nurses, and some of the reasons that they don't have workers or they don't have nurses is they don't have care. So we're entering into conversations with those types of places as well as our school partners. But
excellent. Michele, did you have something to add?
No, I think you guys covered it. We can,
Okay.
there's a couple questions in the chat that it would probably.
You want to start with those?
Sure. So the first one about, as big organizations, if we're struggling, how is expansion doable for smaller and standalone? I think there's some added struggles. There's no question to do expansion on your own. I was on the board for many years of my children's child care center, which was a standalone. So I know the struggles from a board perspective anyways, of the standalones, and sort of staying on top of everything, and having a board that maybe is even a little more stretched, because they're obviously mostly parents with children in the center. So so I think that, you know, to be realistic, it's not an easy thing to contemplate, but you know, you need to assess really your own capacities first and foremost. And really, I think that critical bit that I spoke to earlier is engaging the board in the fun parts of the conversation. Oh, isn't it exciting? And the tough parts of the conversation. What are the risks? And being really honest about where you're at as an organization, both in terms of your capacities to take on what expansion means, which is a lot of work. There's no question about it. It's a lot of work to open a new center, and where, or that is just not in the cards for us. We're not there at this moment in time. I think that that may be, you know, where some organizations have to land, and that's okay, because I hope and presume that there are going to be other opportunities down the road. Not expansion isn't going to happen just in 2023. There is this window, which is still short to 2020. What is it? 2026, early part of 2026, March, I guess, that they want to see all these targets reached. I'm not convinced that it's going to happen. It's a lot, 86,000 spaces in a 3-year window, when we still have questions like the one quite aptly put in the chat about where's the capital. It means that I think that what may come over time is sort of some extensions on those targets. Certainly, we're going to hope to see a continuation of CWELC beyond the 5 years of the current agreements. And so whether there's a vision for additional expansion, who knows? So I think it's really important to be open, honest, and have the tough conversations about whether or not you're ready. And if you're not ready now, then have it again in a little while. And it may be that the answer is we're just not there yet, and we may never get there. And, you know, and if you can continue to operate within the environment that you're in and at the size that you're at, then maybe that's where you stay. But I think it's worth an exploration, because there are so many opportunities, and it starts with those conversations we've talked about. I won't touch on the capital because you guys may have other things to add, but we can get to that after.
Okay, I'll just add quickly before Joe, the whole purpose actually of why B2C came to exist, right, was because we recognize the larger agencies probably already have the resources and support and the need to be able to expand. But what about the smaller centers? And we wanted to make sure that that was an option, because we're going to need every single person in this as we're building this system. Every single space is going to be valuable and valued. So look to the B2C that website, look at the resources we're offering, and the intention is that, you know, you're not having to do it alone, that there could be some support for you.
The only thing that I can add to that is, as an organization, part of our strategic plan was also to investigate and build capacity for other childcare programs and to offer shared services. So there might be other people out there that could help you with the financial pieces. There could be part that would help you with the staffing recruitment. Is there other agencies out there that could support you to help you to expand as well? So just another idea.
Yeah, and it's, you know, Jill, is so important because it speaks to, again, you know, our intention is that we're a very friendly sector. You know, our intention is to children and families being able to access quality early learning and childcare. It's not that necessarily we want to build empires or be offering services exclusively by ourselves. So we do want every single partner to be successful in the not-for-profit realm, and different ways that we can assist is really important to us. The capital question. I wish I had the answer. Oh my goodness. You know, it's very, that's a barrier. So the way, you know, we've forever, when there was opportunities for expansion, right? We were used to there being a capital grant. We would apply for it. It would never be enough money, but at least it would be something. And for lots of different reasons, the province is changing directions, and instead they're going to fund the actual accommodation costs, which would include your leasehold improvements or the cost of financing for a build or whatever, presumably, right? We still don't have all of those details, and the funding structure is not entrenched yet, but that's the premise. The challenge, of course, is not-for-profits are often really restricted in being able to borrow money. And I had a chance to present at the House of Commons committee for the early learning bill. And that was one of the questions that was coming up. And one of the recommendations from B2C2 and from Education Children's Services is that the federal government look at a federal loan opportunity. And we've also been asking the province to look at this because there is actually infrastructure funding to borrow, but early childhood education aren't the eligible borrowers. Community centers and long-term care and others are, but it's not listed there under the provincial infrastructure. So there's a gap, right? And so they need to catch up if they're going to ask us to be able to finance or to go out and seek financing, and they need to catch up and allow this to happen. Because we know that we can't, right? People don't have reserves to be able to finance these buildings over and over and over again. They just don't. We are going to need another model. Again, that is something that is looking at. And again, we're going to continue to be advocating. That would also be another conversation for you to have both with your CMSND staff and the province to say, again, we're ready, but this is a barrier. And I can share because it's public. It was on the committee recording. Also presenting at the same session as myself was a woman who is responsible for leading, I guess, the collective of for-profits, like at their association. That's what it said. And she said that she actually wanted to be a not-for-profit initially, but she couldn't get a loan for the $1 million to build her building. And so a for-profit to deliver the same service is able to get a loan, but a not-for-profit is not. So there's clearly some work to be done beyond our sector as well, with lending institutions and others that we can.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I expect there's going to be some movement on this at some point. It's not part of the original funding allocations under CWELC, or at least not in the way that any of us would like to see it. So there's been a lot of advocacy, and I think there'll continue to be advocacy. In fact, Kim and I were part of a couple of conversations just recently with both the federal government and the provincial government, where we were saying, the capital question, it has to be addressed. How are we going to do expansion without capital? As not-for-profits. I mean, we know how it'll happen with some of the commercial sector. I mean, there's real estate trusts, there's investors, there's venture capitalists, all sort of circling around to see where can we put our money to be able to, at least in the capital side, to be able to take advantage of CWELC. And I think, it behooves our governments to be A, aware of that, and B, have a response to it, if in fact there is the commitment that's stipulated in the agreements around proportionality, maintaining existing proportionality, which in Ontario, at the start of CWELC was 70% not-for-profit, 30% commercial, and that's what we want to see maintained, if not enhanced. So there's going to have to be some response from government at some point, and fingers crossed that we'll get there with the advocacy that a bunch of us have been trying to do. And I would encourage all of you to do that too. Keep raising the question. It's one thing to raise it here, happy to answer it, but in fact, the question needs to be posed of your, municipal councillors, of your MPPs, of your MPs. All of them need to hear capital is going to be a barrier. We need access to capital to be able to achieve this plan.
I would just say keep advocating, sharing your spaces, sharing the knowledge that we have as early learning and care providers, and the why it's important to stay with not-for-profit. I think that's the big messaging right now, at least in our communities. We feel like we're being surrounded by the you know, the big box people to come in and they're just waiting in the wings for those expansion dollars to be released.
Mhm.
And so yeah, we just have to keep plugging away and sharing the why and sharing our voices.
Yes, definitely. So there was a question also about, can you start to look at locations now, even if you don't know where there's needing to be expansion? So each CMSM and DSAP were given their allocations. And so what I did, and Andrew Fleck, I mean, I was aware, okay, there's X number of spaces that are coming to our CMSM, and we know the criteria, how a vulnerable neighborhood is defined, and the target is 37%. And so I just looked for that data, and I was able to plot out, okay, well, we have these aspirational projects already, and potential locations, which ones of those might actually fit the criteria. And so you would look at your, I'm hoping that you could look at that through Statistics Canada or other places where you'd be able to find that information fairly reasonably. But if not, I would go and ask your CMSMs and say, okay, we want to be ready. Can you give us an idea which municipalities, which neighborhoods, where might you be looking for there to be expansion? If we make that public, those have been shared, they haven't necessarily been approved they've been shared from the CMSM to the province, they've not necessarily been approved, but why couldn't they start to give that detail out, just so you can start to look to see what options there might be? I mean,
Well, and the worst thing they could say is no, I'm not going to tell you, but it doesn't hurt to ask.
Exactly. It's important that they understand. I think sometimes there's a belief, right, that, okay, well, once it's off their plate, so we've identified it, now the rest is going to happen at breakneck speed, and it doesn't, right? Everything takes quite a bit of time. And so being prepared, at the very least, even if you don't get an answer, you could start to look to see, well, who might be a partner, or where might there be options, where will zoning be applicable? Start to do just a little bit of background work, just to. I know we've only got 3 minutes. I just wanted to quickly share a bit on the benefits of building ownership versus leasing. So, there's pros and cons to each, and I don't want to try to get into the details, but I did want to say that if you are considering a leasing arrangement, please think about something very long term that is really going to allow you to stay in that location. A 5-year lease, a 10-year lease is not enough. You're putting a huge investment in transforming that space. Those leasehold improvements will still be expensive. And so you'd be wanting a really long, like a 20-year lease or even longer if you can, 20 with a renewal period or something, because otherwise, you could put otherwise you or the person who replaces you will be responsible for trying to dismantle a service that's become really anchored in a community, and that can be quite heartbreaking. And we've seen lots and lots of examples of that. So make sure your lease terms are really, really long. Any final words, Michele and Jill, before we wrap up?
No, I think it's been wonderful. Thank you.